Good evening and a very warm welcome on a very miserable evening to the new club and to this meeting of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club. I'm delighted to see you all this evening and that everybody could make it for an exciting talk ahead. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Stead, who is the curator at the Palace of Holyrood House, and as such very well placed to be talking to us this evening about the topic of this evening's talk, the visit of George IV to Edinburgh in 1822. And of course this talk was due to take place during that anniversary in August 2022, sadly had to be postponed, so we're doubly delighted that Emma is here to talk to us this evening. Just to tell you a little bit about Emma first of all, Emma's background, her undergraduate degree was at the University of St Andrews, an undergraduate degree in history. After that she was a curatorial intern at Windsor Castle in catalogues and books and manuscripts. After that she took a position as a cataloguer for, I believe, the then Wessexers, now Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. In 2018 she moved to become the assistant curator at the Palace of Holyrood House, and since 2022 has held the position of curator of the Palace of Holyrood House. So Emma, it's a pleasure to have you here and very much looking forward to hearing all about George IV in the Royal Collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I think it's important to preface this lecture with a disclaimer that I am not a Walter Scott scholar in any sense. So the next sort of 40 minutes or so we'll be looking at him through the lens of the Royal Collection, and particularly with an emphasis, wherever possible, on the Palace of Holyrood House. So everything that I share, with the exception of one slide, comes from objects made up from the Royal Collection. So my colleague Lucy, who I have the pleasure of working with at the Palace, always says that Walter Scott pops up in almost every situation, and that has certainly been my experience when putting together this talk. So I'm going to start with a very brief, well, perhaps not so brief, introduction to George IV. So king from 1820 to 1830, famously one of the most colourful and flamboyant monarchs. He had been Prince of Wales and of course Prince Regent as his father George III was ill. He's known as a great collector, a wonderful builder. By the time he came to the throne, he's 57 years old. I know he doesn't perhaps look it in his wonderful coronation portrait here, and is already in poor health. He's disliked by the nation. They're quite tired of his lavish lifestyle, his extramarital affairs, and his acrimonious marriage. He had a very splendid coronation. And as I've already mentioned, he's an outstanding but extravagant collector and builder. He acquired many important works of art still in the Royal Collection. He built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton and transformed Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. George's fondness for pageantry helped to develop the ceremonial side of monarchy, and he added a large number of paintings, furniture and ceramics to the collection and spent an awful lot of money in doing so. George IV's visit to Scotland in the summer of 1822 was, I would suggest, the last of 3 visits to his kingdoms and the last of 4 great ceremonial occasions. In July 1821, George IV had been crowned in London, and shortly thereafter he set out to visit Ireland, and a week later Hanover. Although the coronation might be seen in some ways as a rather different occasion, I would like to take a look at the parallels and differences between these 4 events to help set George's time in Edinburgh in context. All 4 occasions, to an extent, relied on invented tradition, and their success relied heavily on the opportunity to see the king in person. George IV never underestimated the power of being seen in public. A natural showman, he was happy to appear before great crowds. Mary Frampton described him, never so happy in show and state, and there he shines incomparably. For many who saw him, even at a great distance through the crowds, this would be as close as they could get to the king, who would otherwise only be known to them through prints, coloured illustrations, or stamped on their coins. There are many contemporary commentaries on the effect of George's personal appearance on the crowds. A single incident demonstrates this. For example, in February 1821, when the king's popularity was at a rather low ebb during the trial of Queen Caroline, he attended the theatre at Drury Lane for the first time since his accession to the throne. The diarist Charles Greville, who was present, reported that he was received with immense acclamations, the whole pit standing up, hurrahing and waving their hats. If such a moment could cause such approbation, then the full panoply of a royal ceremony setting the monarch onto a gilded stage could only reinforce the point still more. Richard Rush, the American ambassador to Britain in the early 19th century, and therefore conscious of the republican state of his own country, was determined to curtail any sense of admiration for the king, and his accounts are filled with justifications that as ambassador he must observe certain protocols, whether or not he agrees with the monarchical state. But Rush himself described being swept up by watching the official procession for the state opening of Parliament, seeing the king in his carriage and the full magnificence of the event, and becomes very poetic about the scene, comparing it to something from Dryden or Virgil. Even more, when meeting George in person at an official drawing room, a reception for mixed company, at which the king would mingle with his guests, Rush could not help but exclaim, "The whole was harmony, like old English buildings in Shakespeare. It carried the feelings with it, triumphing over criticism." It is worth remembering that the coronation and subsequent visits took place only shortly after the defeat of the person who George saw as the great usurper and someone who had imperiled the ancient regime and monarchy, Napoleon. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, both the American and French revolutions and the prolonged regency during George III's final illness had served to make the British monarchy feel insecure. There was a great sense of change in the political borders of Europe. Hanover, for example, had been created a kingdom only in 1814 as a result of the Congress of Vienna. Moreover, there was political and religious unrest throughout the outlying territories. The memory of Jacobite uprisings was not far from the minds of the Scots, and in Ireland there were issues of religious liberation and the Catholic emancipation. Added to this was George's very public divorce from Queen Caroline, during which many had flocked to the support of the Queen rather than the King. This was clearly the moment, therefore, for the King to make a favourable impression. George IV's coronation on the 21st of July 1821 was of course the most sacred occasion of his life, and at the same time a very public event. The King had had, in effect, 10 years to plan the event, and had read widely in histories of earlier coronations, especially those of the Stuart kings. And if certain parts of the ceremony harked back to ancient tradition, this was also a piece of theatre, and ideal for George to show himself off. So, for his coronation, George IV decided to wear robes that, although not entirely accurately recreated, reflected a vision of early 17th century dress. This was no coincidence. George was emphasising his historic antecedents all the way back to James VI. He himself wore a ruffed collar with silk doublet and hose. And in the coronation procession, the king wore what was described as a Spanish hat, although it was actually inspired by the early 17th century hats worn by James VI and by Henry IV of France. And over the hat, he wore the diamond circlet, which we now know as a diamond diadem, which you see here on the right, the design of which had been in part suggested by George himself. In it, we see the thistle, rose, and shamrock for each of his nations, and the use of these national emblems is repeated again and again in the 4 visits. The other repeated motif were the oak leaves, a symbol of longevity and strength, and traditionally associated with Britain. The national emblems were also repeated in the robes, embroidered over gold silk over his cloak, and the enormously long mantle, which I haven't depicted here, which was worn in the procession. The king was seen by vast crowds of people. The pageantry and spectacle made an enormous impact. Walter Scott, who was present at the coronation, later wrote, "Those who witnessed it have seen a scene calculated to raise the country in their opinion, and to throw into the shade all scenes of similar magnificence from the field of the cloth of gold down to the present day." If this was hyperbole, it did at least show that the intentions behind the great magnificence, all of the gilt and gorgeousness, had its desired effect. Scott's emphasis on the historic nature of the ceremony as reinforcing George's own position, and the patriotic descriptions of the event showed that it was successful. The visit to Dublin took place only a few weeks after the coronation in London. As one contemporary put it, George had conceived the patriotic idea of making himself known to the remotest of his people. Moreover, George was curious to travel and to see his other realms. After the triumph of the coronation, he set off to Ireland. During the voyage, he heard of the death of Queen Caroline, but decided to continue with the visit. He landed in Ireland on the 12th of August in a small village near Dublin. This was to be the first peaceful visit to Ireland of a reigning monarch, and crowds gathered to see their king arrive. A cast was even taken of the king's first steps on Irish soil. Touched at his welcome, George claimed, "My heart has always been Irish." From there, he travelled to the summer residence at Phoenix Park and spent a slightly subdued 3 days to mark the death of his wife. His entry into the city of Dublin, pictured here, took place on the 17th of August. A procession of 200 carriages was organised, with the king riding in an open carriage so that he would be visible to all. George elected to wear the uniform of a field marshal, with his orders, including the Order of St. Patrick, the most senior Irish order of chivalry, and a prominent rosette of shamrocks on his hat. Dublin was bedecked with illuminations and transparencies, which are massive linen or paper sheets. Lights were shone through them, and these presented like tableaux and motifs. And sadly, few, if any, of these actually survive today. A group of Irish artists were commissioned by the Royal Irish Institution to record the events of the king's visit. As the king passed under the temporary structure of the archway, he stood up in the carriage to ensure that he was all the more visible. One contemporary newspaper noted that all eyes were fixed on the king. His Majesty was the sole object of attention, enthusiasm, affection, and love. The procession continued to Dublin Castle, the home of the Viceroy, where he was presented with the Irish Sword of State, a piece of regalia dating back to the restoration of Charles II, a symbol of authority and traditionally used to represent the king in his absence. Here again we see a strong link to the Stuarts, and again you see on the right-hand side the motifs, the rose, thistle, and shamrocks. In the days that followed, there were a series of events to welcome the king: a levee for gentlemen, a drawing room for ladies, visits to significant buildings in Dublin, as well as a trip to the races, where the king was asked to present one of the prizes, and a visit to the theatre. Souvenirs of the occasion were created, often using local materials. And during the visit, those who approached the king were asked to dress entirely in Irish-made apparel, at George's request. This request harked back to earlier receptions in George's life. At the first fete held during the Regency in 1811 at George's London residence, Carlton House, guests were told that dresses made of materials of native manufacture only should be adopted. Such a request was intended to boost the local textile and fashion industries. Over the course of his visit, George invested in a number of recipients with the Order of St. Patrick, encouraging a wider network of loyal subjects throughout his kingdom, but also, again, emphasising the specifically Irish feel to the occasion. The visit to Hanover took place only shortly afterwards. Sailing from Ramsgate, the king travelled via Waterloo to see the place of the great victory over Napoleon. To George, who had never left Britain, this was an important journey. The special relationship between the two kingdoms was almost unique. Although the monarch since George I had ruled both Britain and Hanover, the link between the two was only through the person of the king himself, and therefore was known as the personal union. No monarch from Britain had visited Hanover for 66 years, and there had been no visit since the elevation of Hanover to a kingdom in 1814. There was no tradition for a coronation or a monarchical visit. In many ways, the visit to Hanover was the most low-key of events, and little, if any, visual record of the visit survives, although contemporary written accounts give a good record of the events. In his arrival on the 7th of October, the king went first to the summer residence pictured here, the Palace of Herrenhausen. The palace had had improvements made before the royal visit. That evening, George entered the city of Hanover. Once again, he wore a field marshal's uniform, although on this occasion it was that of a Hanoverian regiment, and with it he wore the Order of Guelph, a newly created order presented to those who had made significant contributions to the Napoleonic Wars or for his subjects in Hanover. The king rode in a gilt carriage brought specially from England for the occasion. The carriage procession into the city passed through a temporarily erected triumphal arch, decorated with figures symbolically presenting gifts to the king. At the end of the procession, George gave a speech in German, claiming that "I have always been a Hanoverian, I will live and die a Hanoverian." As in Ireland, his triumphal entry was watched over by vast crowds. Bells were rung and illuminations displayed through the route. Over the following days, he attended a levee and drawing room, held a review of the troops, visited the theatre and watched fireworks. He was not well enough to attend the planned hunt, but did hold individual audiences and made investitures. These then are the contexts for George's Scottish visit. By the end of 1821, he had successfully presented himself as English, Irish and Hanoverian by turns to his nations, and those of you familiar with the events of the Edinburgh visit will have already picked up echoes from each of these three occasions when he reached Scotland. As in Ireland, and to an extent in England, the visit was set against a backdrop of political tension, and there were rather gloomy predictions about its success before it took place. One crucial difference was that unlike Ireland or Hanover, Scotland already had its own monarchical traditions. George's visit therefore had to thread the needle between the magnificence of a personal appearance and the events surrounding it, and any residual Jacobitism. Another key difference is the quantity of artistic and visual material generated on behalf of this visit. Both David Wilkie and Turner were on hand to sketch and capture the events of the visit, while the works of local artists such as Raeburn, Allen and Naismith were exhibited for the king so that he might judge the state of the art in the Union. Why was it such a big day? It was an occasion imbued with great significance. It was the first visit by a monarch since that of Charles II in 1650 for his Scottish coronation, and the first since the Act of Union joined the Parliaments of England and Scotland in 1707 to create the United Kingdom. The visit, which became known as the King's Jaunt, followed on from these immensely popular tours of the other outlying kingdoms, as already described. So from the 15th to the 29th of August 1822, George IV visited Edinburgh. This royal visit, caricatured as 1 in 20 daft days, had the effect of increasing goodwill towards the monarchy and resulted in a newfound Scottish national identity, uniting Highlander and Lowlander in sharing the iconic symbolism of tartans and kilts. The most important man often described in arranging the visit was the Scottish writer, scholar and antiquarian Sir Walter Scott. He's often described as having stage managed the whole visit, and I'm going to say right now that I have not looked into this enough to have a confident opinion as to what I think, but he had dined with the Prince Regent at Clarence House in 1815. This portrait was commissioned by George IV at a cost of 300 guineas, was begun in London in 1820 and completed in time to be exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1827. He was already a well-established writer, publisher of Waverley, and the discoverer, of course, of the Honours of Scotland at Edinburgh Castle in 1818. The Honours of Scotland, the crown, the sword of state, and the sceptre were Scotland's ancient symbol of royal authority. They had been missing since 1707 and were rediscovered by Scott in Edinburgh Castle. Scott had also attended the King's coronation in London in 1821 and had been deeply impressed and inspired by the richness and historical nature of the ceremonial. Once the visit centred on Edinburgh had been confirmed, Scott's advice was sought, and with only 3 weeks' notice, he was invited by the Lord Provost of Edinburgh to help organise the event. During the 2-week-long extravaganza, Scott is known to have stage managed a series of spectacular ceremonies designed to demonstrate George IV as the legitimate king. George was presented as the latest in a long line of Scottish monarchs, heir to both the Hanoverians and the Jacobites, of a country with a distinctive and unified Highland identity, as emphasised by Scott himself. We are the clan, and our king is the chief. Scott, famed for his novels which recreate a romantic view of Scotland's past, seized this opportunity to present the country as a plaided panorama, overflowing with tartan and Highlanders. Scott was an enthusiastic chairman of the Celtic Society, which promoted Highland culture and dress. The wearing of tartan had become already more widespread since the lifting of the ban on tartan prescribed following the Jacobite Rising of 1745. Tartan attire was encouraged during the visit, and the king himself was persuaded to order a Highland dress for the occasion, more on which later. I'm going to briefly talk about preparations in the Palace of Holyrood House, which was not in a good condition. Holyrood House was extensively spruced up, and most of the grace and favour tenants were evicted to allow a number of events to take place, including a levee for gentlemen and a drawing room or afternoon reception for ladies. The furniture maker's trotter were called in to carry out redecoration and replacement of upholstery and furnishings. The former guard chamber, pictured here of Charles II, was fitted up as a throne room. The ceiling was painted olive brown, the walls lined with scarlet cloth, and mouldings richly gilded. Sumptuous curtains of a deep crimson with gold tassels and fringes were hung in the windows, and a throne was placed below an elaborate canopy. The throne, originally made for the king's mother, Queen Charlotte, was brought up from Buckingham House, later palace, for the visit, and elements of the throne canopy survive in the royal collection today. Little was known about the original usage of this room, and the canopy and throne were erroneously placed at the west end to allow the king to use the great stair as his private entrance. Guests to the royal levee and drawing room gathered in the great gallery and entered into the throne room via the presence chamber. Although this reversed the 17th century processional route, it did allow guests to move through many of the original rooms of the palace, and the throne room has been known by this name since this date. Preparations in the city were rather frantic. These preparations were underway to tidy up the city, and some modifications had a long-lasting effect. So I've chosen to show you this painting by the Scottish artist Alexander Naismith. So this is the view of the High Street of Edinburgh and the Lawn Market, which is set in the old town of Edinburgh. This is depicting the demolition of the Bay House, a 14th century building used to weigh butter and cheese. So you see it on the right hand in the corner here being taken down. The structure was removed in 1822 solely to make way for the procession of George IV from Holyrood House up the Royal Mile to Edinburgh Castle. The next slide, this is the one thing not in the royal collection, but I think it just tells such a good story. The king eventually arrived at Leith, the port of Edinburgh, on the Royal George on the 14th of August, but due to heavy rain did not disembark until the following day. As he stepped ashore, wearing a thistle and sprig of heather in his hat, and a St Andrew's cross presented by the ladies of Edinburgh, the king was greeted enthusiastically by shouts the most hearty and prolonged that ever greeted the ears of a monarch. The king made his ceremonial entry into the city through a series of triumphal arches by way of Leith Walk, Princes Street and Calton Hill to the royal palace of Holyrood House. The various parts of the city unfolded before the king were presented as a series of spectacular and staged tableaux which culminated in the magnificent sight of the palace viewed against the dramatic backdrop of the extinct volcano Arthur's Seat. Huge crowds, as seen here, lined the route, and the whole way for 3 miles from the shore to the palace was one mass of hope and joy, all engrossed with one object and responding to one pulsation. It is believed that as many as 300,000 people watched this procession from Leith to Holyrood House. Once he got to the palace, George was received as King of Scotland in a spectacular and symbolic ceremony when he was presented with the keys by the hereditary keeper, the Duke of Hamilton. The artist Sir David Wilkie, in attendance, recorded the moment in the entrance of George IV to Holyrood House, seen here, which was painted for the king. George, wearing Field Marshal's uniform and the green ribbon of the Order of the Thistle, the highest order of chivalry in Scotland, is shown as he is about to enter the palace of his ancestors. Holyrood is the ancient residence of Scottish monarchs, so the presentation has strong symbolic overtones. The honours of Scotland, the Scottish regalia, are borne on horseback as the king is acknowledged as the legitimate holder of the keys, and so the rightful King of Scotland. And forgive me, I'm going to go through who some of the individual figures in this are. So Alexander, the 10th Duke of Hamilton, the hereditary keeper to the Palace of Holyrood House, is shown kneeling, presented the keys of the palace to the king. To the left of the king, the figure of the Lord Chamberlain, you can see just behind him, points towards the entrance of the palace. George Campbell, the 6th Duke of Argyll, in Highland dress, stands in front of the palace. Behind him, the honours of Scotland are borne on horseback. The crown is held by Sir Alexander Keith, Knight Marshal of Scotland, the sceptre by Lord Francis Leveson Gower, and the sword of state by George Douglas, the 17th Earl of Morton. On the left, near the entrance, stands John Hope, the 4th Earl of Hopetoun, in his uniform as the Captain General of the Royal Company of Archers, the King's bodyguard for Scotland, more on which later. Sir Walter Scott can be seen just beside him to the left of the main entrance. And to the right of the king are trumpeters, a page, and the exon, the junior officer acting for the yeomen of the guard. Amongst the formal ceremonials, enthusiastic spectators clamber over every part of the palace to catch a view of the king. And this is completely taken license by the artist, who has moved the ceremony to outside the palace. In actual fact, George went straight into the palace and was presented with the honours of Scotland in the presence chamber. This is a later image. This is a levee hosted by Edward VII at the palace at the beginning of the 20th century, but I think it gives you a really good understanding of just how many people were in the palace at this time. A number of receptions hosted by the king took place within the palace, including a levee for 1,200 gentlemen and a drawing room for 500 ladies. At the levee, gentlemen were encouraged to wear tartan. At 10 o'clock, carriages started to draw up along London Road. By 12 o'clock, they reached along Waterloo Place to Hanover Street and the end of Princes Street. They were conducted into the Picture Gallery, or Great Gallery, which was already completely crowded before the king had even arrived. Their name was announced, they made their approach, they knelt, kissed the hand of the king, and then withdrew. It was noticed by some of the archers that 15 men were presented every minute. And it only took 1 hour and a quarter to see 2,000 people. The king himself was resplendent in his Highland dress, supplied by George Hunter and Co. of Princes Street, Edinburgh, at a cost of £1,354 and 18 shillings, which is over £140,000 in today's money. The bill for this is still in the Royal Archives and includes 61 yards of royal satin plaid or tartan, 31 yards of royal velvet, and 17.5 yards of royal plaid cashmere. The accoutrements worn with this outfit have been carefully preserved and are usually on display at the Palace of Holyrood House. You see them here. They include a dirk, a powder flask, a sword, a belt, and a sash. And I just wanted to show you in detail some of the details from the blade of the sword. It's made of blued steel and damascened in gold. And the Scottish symbolism, as you can see, is particularly striking. This is definitely not a weapon for war. This is a dress sword of the absolute highest quality. Wilkie obtained an invitation to the levee through Walter Scott and wrote to his sister, "The king looked exceedingly well in tartan. He had on the kilt and the hose with a kind of flesh-coloured pantaloons underneath." Recorded in this portrait depicting the king looking like a Highland chieftain, although without these flesh-coloured pantaloons. This portrait was completed in 1830. And I just wanted to say that both this painting and the accoutrements will form part of our new exhibition opening in the King's Gallery on the 22nd of March. The king was famously lampooned for wearing a kilt too short. So Lady Hamilton Dalrymple, a noted society wit, commented, "Well, since he is to be amongst us for so short a time, the more we see of him, the better." So you already know that David Wilkie took license by moving the ceremony of the keys to the outside of the palace, and we think that perhaps the shade cast over the royal knees is perhaps a bit more flattering than it would have been in real life. Moving on to the drawing room held for the ladies. 3 days later, the king held a drawing room for the ladies at the palace. In Walter Scott's hints, said they must all appear in court plumes and fans. At least 9 feathers must be in each headdress. So 457 ladies of the most distinguished rank, fashion and beauty in Scotland attended. Each received a kiss on the cheek from the king, as you see here. Mary Frances Grant said, "I saw only a pair of thick lips and a grave, respectful face bending towards me. He appeared to me a most immense man, much, much above me." Rather like the levee, the first carriages arrived at the palace at 10 o'clock. The last were still arriving just before 2 o'clock when the king arrived. He wore the uniform of a field marshal rather than the kilt, and this presentation lasted just over an hour. The ladies had been accompanied by their presenters, who were their husbands or other men in the family, so approximately 2,600 people were presented to the king in that period of time. The visit then continued with a number of extremely well-attended events, including a procession from Holyrood House to the castle, a Highland ball, a visit to the theatre, and a review of the troops, much like you might have heard me just mention about his visits to Dublin and Hanover. The most significant moment during the visit was the reinstitution of a ceremony which had taken place at the time of the coronations of Charles I and Charles II, known as the Riding of the Parliaments, in which the honours of Scotland escorted the king along the Royal Mile from Holyrood to the castle. And at the top, from the Half Moon Battery, and despite the poor weather, George stood and waved his hat to the crowds for a quarter of an hour, acknowledging their cheers. When one of his attendants expressed concern that he would get wet, the king is said to have said, "Oh, never mind, I must cheer the people." Like the visit to Ireland, the creation of souvenirs were encouraged by using local materials and local craftsmanship, and this citrine, engraved with a view of the castle on one side and the king on the other, was created in local stones as a remembrance of the event. Near the end of his time in Edinburgh, George IV paid a private visit to the Palace of Holyrood House in order to inspect the historic apartments. The Duke of Hamilton, the hereditary keeper of the palace, took the King to Mary Queen of Scots apartments depicted here. Slightly later, but I think it gives you a good idea. And George gave a special order that whilst the palace was to be repaired, these apartments should be preserved sacred from every alteration. Consequently, the King not only brought Holyrood House back into use as a royal residence, but drew attention to the appeal of the palace as a focus for early Scottish history. And George's final public appearance was at the Theatre Royal for a performance of Scott's Rob Roy, which of course was very popular. After attending a final reception at Hopetoun House on the 29th of August, the King boarded the Royal George and set sail in heavy rain, probably like tonight, for England. The visit, which was witnessed by 1/7 of the Scottish population, was proclaimed a huge success. Our King has seen his people, and they have seen their King. The King himself was gratified by how well the visit had gone, and departed delighted by the presentation of Scotland as an ancient and traditional clan society, designed to heal the rift between Hanoverian monarch and his northern kingdom. There's no doubt that the visit to Scotland formed part of this quartet of ceremonial occasions at which the King presented himself in turn to each nation as one of their own, in England, Ireland, Hanover and Scotland. He and his advisors and choreographers produced ceremonies that drew great crowds and encouraged a sense of patriotic nationalism. George used his own person through his costume, borders and speeches, even if a little fancifully or romantically, to show himself in turn as English, Irish and Hanoverian, and did so again in Scotland, where he presented himself as a full-blown Highland clan chieftain. He sported the national flowers, especially the shamrock and the thistle, and they were strewn liberally through the decorations that surrounded each event. He encouraged the use of local materials and industries to support each event, from the dress of those who were presented to him, such as the souvenirs of the visits. Of course, there was never full approval for any of George's transactions, and certainly great criticism was levelled at him for the vast expense of each occasion. But during each of these visits, he affirmed the importance of the monarchy and provided a focal point for the sense of loyalty in places that had, at the very least, not seen their king in person for half a century. This conscious invention of tradition and the making of majesty was considered hugely successful, and I think that the Scottish visit is the best remembered of the three visits, is possibly due in part to Walter Scott. If we agree that he did stage manage this visit, then the choreography shows that this personal appearance from the monarch was vital in presenting the nation as unified, stable, and at the forefront of European politics. On all occasions during his visit, George was accompanied by the Royal Company of Archers, appointed by the King on Scott's recommendation to act as his personal bodyguard. Originally formed as an archery club in 1676, the Archers wore their distinctive uniform of tartan jacket, tartan trews, Highland hose, flat blue bonnet, ruff, and complete with a quiver of arrows. The Captain General at the time was John Hope, the fourth Earl of Hopetoun. This illustration from a history written 50 years later is taken from the portrait of the Captain General by Sir John Watson Gordon, originally commissioned for Archers Hall, where it still hangs to this day. According to the illustration's caption, this is how he appeared when presenting the barbed arrows at the redendo of the Royal Company on the 15th of August. The book goes on to say, the whole dress has such a quaint medieval tinge about it that we may be almost certain that Sir Walter Scott took part in designing it. It is not at all unlike, in some details, the representations which we have of Robin Hood. This uniform did not long continue to be worn, it being probably found more picturesque than convenient for shooting. The custom of offering a redendo occurred during the visit and still continues to this day, traditionally comprising 3 barbed arrows. The ones presented in 1822 are still in the Royal Collection today. And the Royal Company has, of course, remained the Sovereign's personal bodyguard for Scotland since 1822. And you see the 4th Earl of Hopetoun, as I've already pointed out, in his Royal Company of Archers outfit on the left-hand side of Wilkie's painting, the entrance to the Palace of Holyrood House, right beside Sir Walter Scott. Several of Wilkie's sketches for this painting survive in the Royal Collection today. I'm only showing you a couple of them here. I haven't been able to spot Scott in the drawing on the right, but I'm willing to be proved wrong on this. And then here, where I've spotted quite a nice link between Wilkie and Scott. So the figure in the Highland dress, George Campbell, the 6th Duke of Argyll, was brother to one Lord John Campbell. He was present during the 1822 visit and presented George IV with a small wooden box made by the excellently named Daniel Craig. I hope I've got pictures of them. There we go. I don't know what's happened to the one on the right there. Craig specialised in making boxes from the native Scottish trees. He made both of these for George IV. The bottom one is made from timbers from the Florida, which is the name then given to the Spanish Armada ship destroyed in Tobermory Bay off the Isle of Mull in 1588, and the Dukes of Argyll held the rights to salvage this wreck. The top marquetry box is made of timbers from trees associated with Scottish history and mythology. The yew in the centre, for instance, comes from a tree under which Mary Queen of Scots and Henry Lord Darnley were allegedly betrothed. The base has a transfer print of the music and lyrics to Auld Lang Syne, and Scott had, of course, met Burns in 1787. And the top one is probably the box which Walter Scott presented to George IV during the 1822 visit. And both of these boxes, I should say, will shortly go on display at the Palace of Holyrood House. Other objects associated with Robert Burns were presented to George IV. If we may talk about another Scottish writer for a moment. This beautiful chair, made from the timbers of the old kirk in Alloway and engraved with the poem Tam O'Shanter, was given to George IV. Creating Scottish-flavoured wooden souvenirs at this time was incredibly popular if you think of the prevalence of muslin wear and so on. And this, to me, demonstrates George's collecting taste extending way beyond what we might think in terms of Dutch art and so forth. I have further examples of this, and just to further illustrate Lucy's point that everything always seems to come back to Sir Walter Scott, I just want to show you some other objects in our collection which connect Scott and George IV, or later members of the royal family. So, to start with the penny wedding here, this was commissioned by George IV from Wilkie in 1813 and finished in 1818. It depicts a Scottish wedding, a type of marriage ceremony common in Scotland at the time, where each of the guests paid a penny towards expenses and anything left over went towards the couple's new home. And you see the violinist Neil Goy playing in the background, and his son Nathaniel performed at a banquet held at Parliament House during the 1822 visit, during which George IV is said to have drank from glasses that were 200 years old, supplied by Sir Walter Scott. This painting is a personal lament by Sir William Allen. It's actually the only William Allen in the Royal Collection. It depicts the loss of his friend and supporter, Sir Walter Scott. It's cast in the style of an everyday scene, an everyday life or genre painting, and the orphan is Scott's late daughter, Anne. The scene is the dining room at Scott's house in Abbotsford, and Allen knew the house well. He'd been invited by Scott's son-in-law and biographer, J.G. Lockhart, to record the interior shortly before the writer's death in 1832. The room is filled with works of art that suggest the range of Scott's interest, but it is his massive carved oak chair that evokes most powerfully the absent, monumental figure of Scott. It was in part thanks to Scott that Allen became established as one of the most successful artists of his generation. It was Scott, along with David Wilkie in 1817, who encouraged Allen to draw on episodes from Scottish history, rich in romance and drama, in an effort to revive the tradition of historical painting. Scott also appointed Allen as the first illustrator of the Waverley novels in 1820. In sharing the vision of Scott, Allen ensured that Scottish art and literature ran in parallel in the mid-19th century, and his rise to success followed that of his mentor. Allen also found success as a painter of exotic subjects, inspired by his travels abroad to Russia, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, Spain, and Morocco. He was appointed Master of the Trustees' Academy in Edinburgh, Associate and Member of the Royal Academy, and President of the Royal Scottish Academy in 1838. And in 1841, he succeeded Wilkie as the Queen's Limner for Scotland, and in 1842, he was knighted. This painting, I should say, was acquired probably by William IV or Queen Adelaide and hung from 1841 and for a long time in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. This image of the studio of the celebrated sculptor Sir Francis Chantrey is a portrait conceived not as a physical likeness, but as a record of the sculptor's most celebrated achievements and important relationships. Chantrey worked extensively for King George IV and was knighted by King William IV. He made portrait busts of George III, George IV, William IV, and Queen Victoria. The setting is probably based on Chantrey's studio in Pimlico, And at the centre of the painting, the sculptor's dog, known as Mustard, sits on his master's desk surrounded by his master's modelling tools. And Mustard, you might know, had been given to Chantry as a present by Walter Scott in May 1825. You might be able to see the cat just peeping out of the desk drawer, whose threatened attack on the birds has put Mustard on high alert. Behind the desk is an unfinished bust of Sir Walter Scott. The relationship between Scott and Chantry was evidently one of mutual admiration, Scott praising Chantry for producing works that were as like the original subjects as marble can do to flesh and blood, and Chantry approaching Scott directly for permission to record his likeness, the only time he could ever recollect having asked a similar favour from anyone. The original plaster bust, from which 5 recorded marble replicas were made, was completed in 1820, the year in which Scott received his knighthood. The bust was regarded by his contemporaries as one of Chantry's finest, capturing likeness, expression, and movement in equal measure. In his depiction of the bust, Landseer used his fingers as well as a modelling tool with teeth, which you can see in the drapery, to manipulate the wet paint and create the illusion of roughened clay. Chantry commissioned this painting in April 1835 in an amusing letter to Landseer, supposedly from Mustard the dog. It is typical of Landseer's style, combining anatomically exact animals with rich surface texture and a strong humorous narrative. The painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1836, where it was admired by Queen Victoria and subsequently presented to her by Lady Chantry in 1842, and I was delighted to see a copy of this bust as I came into the new club tonight. There are over 1,000 copies of Walter Scott novels in the Royal Library in Windsor Castle, and I'm going to finish just by highlighting just 2 examples. Queen Victoria famously marked the page of Peveril of the Peak, which she had reached when reading aloud to Prince Albert during his final illness in December 1861. A bookmark of black-edged notepaper was inserted by the Queen at the beginning of chapter 5, which they reached 3 days before his death on the 14th of December. And later, Victoria inscribed the flyleaf of that volume. This book was read up to the mark on page 81 to my beloved husband during his fatal illness and within 3 days of his terrible termination, December the 14th, 1861, and signed it VR. And this first edition of Marmion was presented to Caroline, Princess of Wales, wife of George IV, in 1808, a week before its publication. It came into the Royal Library in February 2022, so as always, Scott continues to be relevant up to the present day. And I'm just going to finish on a final note with a personal confession that I have never read a single Scott novel. But as he crops so often in my field of research, I'm determined to go away and make a start. Perhaps with Waverley, as I know that the Palace of Holyrood House features in that, so perhaps I'll be back around for a second round of lectures. Thank you very much.
And far and wide-ranging journey, and sharing with us some wonderful collection items to help tell the tale as well. So I'm sure that there will be questions if you're happy to take some questions at this point. So I'll open the floor for any questions for our speaker. Right at the back there.
Yeah, just a wee one from the back row. You mentioned the great joining and intention of unification, or the feeling of patriotism. England, Ireland, and Scotland and Hanover, remarkably. In those days, what was the separate identity, if anything at all, of our Welsh cousins as a separate principality? Was that just subsumed within England and Wales as all one thing?
I have to say I've certainly assumed that. I've never looked into it, but that's a really interesting question. I know that, if I may just go back quite a few, but when I was looking at this symbolism of the botanicals and looking at the national flowers, there certainly wasn't anything that indicated even a concession towards Wales. But I would have to look in. I'd have to look into it more to be able to give you a correct answer to that. But it's a very great question. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much. That was I really enjoyed that, and especially at the end, bringing in those items from the collection that really have that connect. And it is so interesting how Scott really crops up in all of that. Something I suppose, this is just something I'm very grateful to you for bringing up to our attention, is just how based in a context of events from which the 1822 visit could take its pick, it really seems to have such strong precedents that it could follow. Yeah, and it's something I've not really been aware of before in the sort of countless talks and the like that I've been to on the subject. So it's really just thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad. It's been an interesting one because there hasn't been much recent historiography, I would say, on the subject. And as far as I can tell, they haven't particularly looked at it through the lens of these other visits that took place. So something for someone else to do, perhaps, someone with more time than me. But I think it's an interesting consideration.
Yeah, I'm extremely interested by the sword you showed us from Dublin. No, not that
yes.
one, the other one, the Irish one. And I wondered if Mark Dennis, who produced the new sword used at the Honours of Scotland, took any inspiration from that Irish one, to your knowledge. I was looking particularly at the hilt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed the similarities. I haven't met him, so I've not had the chance to ask him, but I would like to think so. That
we can ask.
Yes.
Yes, the point that's occurring to me was that the Bourbons in Paris did eventually live in Edinburgh after the revolution, and I wondered whether Sir Walter Scott had some kind of understanding of the old alliance via his wife, who came from Lyon in France. And, you know, I don't know whether there's any evidence of an awareness
Yes.
by Sir Walter Scott of that.
Yes, because the exiled French lived at Holyrood, of course, for 20 years, and maybe luckily for this visit, have been reinstated to the French throne, and then came back to Holyrood later. So he wasn't one of the grace and favour tenants that was evicted to make way for George IV. But I've always, just from a sort of Holyrood perspective, I always found it interesting that Holyrood is not considered in good enough condition for George IV to stay there. He, of course, stays at Dalkeith, but that Charles X is considered perfectly fine for him.
Yeah.
Although I think that also has more to do with Holyrood being a debtor's sanctuary and the fact that Charles X is able to stay there in sort of safety, if you like, without fear of being, I don't know what the word is. Charged, I suppose, charged with his debt, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, yes.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. Just continuing the Welsh issue that was raised earlier this evening, or the absence of Wales in this. Dominic Riley was speaking last night in Edinburgh to the Edinburgh Decorative Fine Arts Society, EDFAS, and he has worked in the Royal Library at Windsor. And he made that very point, that Wales is absent, but he was talking more to do with dedication pages. And he never found in the Royal Library at Windsor a book where when you open it, it's dedication to a monarch. England is mentioned, Scotland, Ireland, but no reference to Wales. And as a half Welshman, he was not best pleased by that particular thing, but I'm afraid it's just one of those anomalies, yes.
I think perhaps on the Welsh question, one of the things I've always wondered about was that because Oxford and Cambridge were run on the basis that they had to be an Anglican to join that university, and it was Gladstone who removed that, who came from Leith and Lewis and east of Ross and Biggar. I wondered if the Welsh didn't have a feeling of national identity to the same extent that Scotland had, because they had been taken over in Henry VIII and subsumed into England. And the Welsh came up to Glasgow University before the foundation of the University of Wales in the 1880s because, well, we took in anybody. You know, I mean, that was no disrespect to us. It was open. And that was, of course, part of the problem in Ireland with the Irish ascendancy, that they ruled. It was an aristocratic royal arrangement, and the Parliament was there, and there wasn't Roman Catholic emancipation until 1829. Interesting to get more information on that.
Yeah. I've just been thinking about that Welsh question, and I think that word subsumed that you used is totally correct. And I think perhaps another strong indicator is the fact that there was no royal visit to Wales, that it was considered, either it was considered and dismissed, or it just wasn't even considered as a sort of worthy recipient for a visit, which suggests to me that certainly the English people felt that Wales didn't have a national identity. But as I say, I've not looked into it, so I wouldn't want to speak as an authority on it.
Yeah. David, go ahead. If we can return to Scotland, thank you for a very well researched and scholarly talk. One thing worthy of development is the story of the adoption of the tartan as part of our national dress and identity. The haberdashers of Edinburgh were besieged by clan chiefs demanding to know, what is my tartan? Because tartans until that time had not been family oriented, but in fact regional. There was a Caithness tartan, an Easter Ross tartan, etc. And the acceptance of the tartan by the rest of Scotland was not without incident. Any of my own ancestors, farmers and soldiers on the borders, if they had seen a kilt come across one of their fields, they would have had no hesitation in putting a sword through it fairly recently beforehand. Scotland did a superb job in giving us this national identity.
Supplementary to that, I was going through my mind as we talk about tartan. I can remember our uncle having hunting Stuart, ancient Stuart, and dress Stuart. And I wondered when that kind of gradation and level of sophistication came in to what was just the plate of the tartan. I mean, I don't know enough about the sartorial, but maybe somebody else here can, offer up some explanation, because there would be times when you would wear one and not the other.
Yeah, that's nearly another lecture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perhaps that exploration of the many tartans could give us something to talk about further after this lecture over a glass of wine in just a few moments. But just to bring the Q&A towards a close, and I think Emma, you'll be joining us for that reception in a few minutes, so potentially further questions can be asked there. On behalf of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, I'd like to offer you our sincere thanks, Emma, for coming and delivering this lecture for us this evening. As has been alluded to during those questions there, what's been particularly fantastic, I think, has been to see the visit of George IV to Scotland in 1822 in the context, a wider context of events. And indeed, I'm sure I wasn't the only one in the room sort of thinking, that sounds very familiar, whilst you were listing lots of the events and activities that took place in Dublin and in Hanover, and of course in George IV's coronation as well. I would have paid a lot of money to see Scott in George IV's coronation ceremony, because I can imagine the magnificence and spectacle of that would have been almost too much to bear for Scott, and he might have been scribbling notes and taking much inspiration that would come in handy just over a year or so later for the visit to Edinburgh. You revealed some really sort of fascinating facts to us about the items that were born out of that visit, and a personal favourite is the Tam O'Shanter chair, and some truly terrifying things, for example, the ceiling of the throne room being painted olive brown, which I think was probably a universally bad decision, so I'm glad that that's changed over time. You've also given us, I'd say, a lovely gift of that phrase that I personally am going to be using in the future, which is alluding to Scott as having a quaint medieval, a taint of quaint medievalism, which I think is a lovely way of describing Scott as well. But really, as I say, I think joining up those dots and seeing Scott in the picture, popping up in the picture, but in a much bigger picture, and pushing that well-known story of the visit into a much bigger context has been really eye-opening. So thank you ever so much, Emma, for your lecture this evening on behalf of the Scott Club. Thank you. Before we all leave this room, and as I say, as ever, you're welcome to join for a glass of wine, some refreshments as well. If I can just remind you of a couple of the events that we have coming up. I'm going to have to look at my notes for this one here. So the 11th of April is the next one. This is Reimagine Scott, and that will be delivered by Greg Moody. On the 9th of May is the annual dinner, the 114th annual dinner with Professor Penny Fielding. And then on the 6th of June, we have Sir Walter Scott, the greatest of them all, who would dispute it, with Eric Milligan. So if you're interested, if you haven't got tickets for those and you're interested in taking part, please just let myself, David or Lee know. And as I say, I do very much hope that we'll be able to stay for our reception afterwards. And once again, thank you all.